Welcome to GCSE LitVerse. Today we're answering a question that may appear in the AQA exam. Compare how poets present ideas about the effects of war in Poppies and one other poem of your choice. We'll model the comparisons you need. Well, war does not end on the battlefield. It lingers, in photographs, in memories, in empty rooms. Some carry it home. Others are forced to witness it. Two voices, two perspectives, one shared truth. War leaves damage behind. Let's unpack the trauma. Initially, both poets present the suffering of individuals affected by war. However, Weir presents this suffering as immediate, emotional, and deeply personal, whereas Duffy presents suffering as something that must be distanced and controlled in order to be endured, highlighting the overwhelming trauma of war. Weir writes, "Spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade, of yellow bias binding around your blazer." The violent imagery of spasms suggests uncontrollable pain, while the domestic act of sewing becomes symbolic of emotional struggle. This shows how war disrupts everyday life, bringing conflict into the home and into the mother's personal experience. This creates a feeling of anxiety and suppressed grief. The reader senses the mother's emotional turmoil beneath ordinary actions. Weir focuses on the impact of modern conflict on families, particularly mothers. Her purpose is to show that war affects not only soldiers, but also those left behind.
On the other hand, Duffy presents suffering as something that cannot be faced directly. It must be controlled to be endured. Duffy writes, "Spools of suffering set out in ordered rows." Here, human pain is reduced to something physical and manageable. The metaphor of spools suggests that suffering is tightly wound, contained, and stored away. This reflects the photographer's need to create emotional distance from the horrors he has witnessed. Unlike the raw, immediate grief in Poppies, suffering here is processed and organized as a way of coping. However, this control is artificial. War itself is chaotic, yet it is presented in ordered rows, suggesting that this structure is imposed to prevent psychological overwhelm. This creates a sense of discomfort and unease. The reader recognizes that this distance is not coldness, but necessity, a way to survive exposure to trauma. The contrast between suffering and ordered highlights the tension between chaos and control. Duffy highlights the psychological toll of witnessing war. She suggests that those who document conflict must distance themselves emotionally in order to function, revealing just how traumatic war truly is. At the same time, she subtly critiques how this process turns real human suffering into something structured and consumable.
Both poets explore the emotional effects of war. However, Weir presents suffering as a deeply personal experience of loss, whereas Duffy presents the burden of witnessing the suffering of others, highlighting the moral and emotional responsibility carried by the observer. Weir presents the mother's suffering as internal and personal, shaped by absence, memory, and emotional release, when Weir writes, "After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage." The metaphor of releasing the bird symbolizes letting go, but also emotional vulnerability. This suggests the mother is struggling to process separation and loss. Weir presents the mother's suffering as internal and personal, shaped by absence, memory, and emotional release. This creates a sense of fragile acceptance. The reader feels both love and pain as the mother attempts to cope. Weir reflects the emotional impact of war on civilians. She emphasizes the psychological toll of absence and uncertainty.
In contrast, Duffy presents a very different kind of suffering, not lived directly, but witnessed. A stranger's features, faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. This shows the moment an image develops, but also symbolizes how the photographer relives the suffering of others. The half-formed ghost suggests that these experiences are never fully processed or understood. They linger, incomplete, and continue to haunt him. Unlike Poppies, where the pain comes from personal loss, here the suffering comes from repeatedly witnessing trauma that does not belong to him, yet still affects him deeply. This creates feelings of inescapable torture. The reader feels the haunting nature of these images, not fully visible but impossible to ignore. Duffy highlights the moral and psychological burden placed on those who document war. She suggests that witnessing suffering carries its own form of trauma, raising questions about responsibility and emotional detachment.
Ultimately, both poets call on society to feel sympathy towards the painful reality of suffering caused by war. However, Weir presents this through intimate personal grief that invites sustained empathy and remembrance, whereas Duffy critiques society's fleeting and superficial responses, exposing how easily suffering is consumed and forgotten. Weir writes, "I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone." The act of tracing suggests a desire to connect physically and emotionally with loss, as if preserving memory through touch. The simile, like a wishbone, introduces a sense of longing, suggesting hope, but also the impossibility of change. This presents society's response to war as deeply personal and ongoing, rooted in remembrance and emotional connection. This creates quiet, reflective sadness. The reader is invited to slow down and engage with grief in a meaningful way, encouraging sustained empathy rather than momentary reaction. Weir reflects the importance of remembrance in modern society. She encourages readers to recognize the lasting emotional impact of war on individuals, particularly families, and to engage with that suffering more deeply.
However, Duffy presents a far more uncomfortable truth about society. Duffy writes, "The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers." This suggests that society does respond emotionally to suffering, but only briefly. The verb prick implies a quick, superficial reaction rather than deep emotional engagement. The contrast between tears and everyday routines like bath and pre-lunch beers shows how quickly this emotion is replaced by comfort and normality. Unlike Poppies, where grief is sustained and meaningful, Duffy suggests that society consumes suffering without truly confronting it. This creates guilt and clear criticism of the ignorance of society towards the true cost of war. The reader is forced to reflect on their own behavior, recognizing how easily they may move on from the suffering of others. Duffy critiques Western society's passive consumption of war imagery. She exposes how distance allows people to experience emotion without responsibility, suggesting that society's response to war is ultimately shallow and ineffective.